Welcome back to my channel, Famous and Fabulous. What really took place after Dan Blocker. The much-loved show's star died, so all of a sudden, fans remember him as the sweet Hos Cartwright. But with the camera, he left behind a family, a secret fortune, and even an abandonment of his wife's. For one of the kids quietly stepped his way into Hollywood, and even his co-stars were shocked. And what about the beach that's named after him, or the stay for the truth about how much he's worth? Because the real story of Dan Blocker is so even more shocking and heartbreaking than you think. Let me take you all the way. Back to December 10th, 1928. Dalhart, Texas. A little town, quiet, simple. Well, not so quiet when Dan was born. Why? Because he tipped the scales at a whopping 14 lbs at birth. The largest baby ever born in Bowie County. Locals joked that Dan didn't crawl, he stomped. Dan's early life wasn't exactly a Hollywood script. His parents, Aura Shack Blocker and Mary Arizona Blocker, were regular folks trying to survive the rough winds of the Great Depression. Shack lost everything when the economy crashed and ended up opening a small grocery store just to get by. Here's where it gets interesting. Dan spent most of his childhood carrying groceries and stocking shelves. But with his size, let's just say he wasn't exactly built for delicate work. His dad used to joke that he might have to pay people just to take Dan off his hands because he was knocking over more cans than he was stacking. But hey, that same problem would one day make him a common name. We need to fast forward a bit to when Dan hit 13 and started at the Texas Military Institute. At this point, he was already a mountain of a kid and got a spot as a linebacker on the football team. And sure enough, football paid for his schooling at Sul Ross State University, where he planned to be an English teacher. Yep, the future TV cowboy was first hoping for a quiet, life-giving grades on work. But one day, the theater area needed a strong person, enough to move the big props around in a play. Who else but Dan? But here's a twist. He did more than just move things. Behind the scenes, he was cast in the show. And what did the big man fall in love with? Not yet with a person, but with the stage itself. Laughs and cheers spotlight. He switched right away. He gave up footballs for footlights, English for play, and never went back. After high school, life threw another surprise. Duty called during the Korean War, and Dan said, "I'm serving with honor and coming back as an honored soldier." He even a Purple Heart, and while he was tough on the battlefield, but his heart was about to get really soft. Why? He married the love of his life right after the war. Of his life, Dolph Parker. Here you may wonder who Dolphia is. She wasn't a Hollywood starlet named Dolphia, was a smart, strong and brave young woman from Oklahoma doing work behind the scenes in theater where she met Dan. And yes, the Dan was feeling good the first time they met. Goof. He was getting in the way of a rehearsal and Dolphia had to tell him to stop talking. He has a new wife by his side. Dan was sure he knew everything. I got a master's degree after going back to school. Degree in theater arts and even began teach high school English and drama students in Texas and then in New. But this is where fate pushed him. Again, the family moved farther west, and was he chasing him closer to California? A PhD was all he wanted, not fame, in acting and a steady job, but to pay the bills, Dan began trying out for TV roles. Westerns were all the rage, and Dan fit the bill perfectly. Throughout the 1950s, you could spot him popping up on hit shows like Gunsmoke, The Rifleman and Maverick. He wasn't a star yet, but he was getting closer, and then in 1958 he landed a part they play on Cimarron City. The show didn't last long, but don't roll the titles yet. That short-lived gig opened the door to something much bigger. Producer David Daughter was cooking up brand new show Bonanza and needed someone for the part of Eric Hos Cartwright, the middle Cartwright's son. It's not the best tool in the shed, but when it came to Heart Dan, it was pure gold. Did really well in the test, and that was that. He turned into Hos, and let me tell you, Hos, he wasn't just another TV cowboy, the show's heart. But here's Dan was something most people don't know. Off-screen, he had been living that role, those same kind, warm and gentle traits. Softy under that tall frame, kids, people had faith in him and loved him. The first episode of Bonanza aired on TV in 1959. It blew up. For 13 years in a row. Fans couldn't get enough of the show, only about gunfights and saloons' real problems like racism and family trust. And Dan, he was there at the heart of everything, making sure that this scene hit home, but it didn't pull Dan away from where he came from. He moved his friends and family to California so they could stay put. He stayed close, still the humble guy who used to stock shelves in his dad's food store, even after acting with Frank Sinatra, in movies like Lady and Come Blow Your Horn. Dan stayed true to Bonanza in cement. Don't forget that Dan wasn't just busy herding animals on the screen. He and Drake and Dolphia built a life together by, there are 4 children, twin girls, Deborah and Dana, and her 2 boys, David and Dirk. Everyone at home laughed, loved, and said yes, lots of chaos. Dan loved being a father, even if it meant giving up his. Sometimes a cowboy hat for a diaper bag. But while Dan was taking over Hollywood, also he did everything he could to give his kids a straightforward as kids. He didn't want them to grow up. That's why they thought fame was normal. In spite of his rising fame, the Blocker family moved into a simple Northridge house with 4 bedrooms. California. This is only 20 mi from Paramount, the places where Bonanza was filmed. Flashy, just a 3-bathroom. House and a swimming pool. That's great. For Dan drove a Corvette and had 4 wild kids. It was okay with Stingray, but she stuck with Dolphia, a dependable 1963 Cadillac, that they weren't caught up in the glitz of Hollywood. When we talk about family, Dan's huge 260-pound frame often turned. He turned normal parenting into comedy gold. The kids would laugh as he squeezed himself, their electric racetrack set up just to test it, or when he was just having fun fight with them in the garden. That's the kind of dad who was there and fun. You're never too big to lie down with his kids. That's the truth of fame. Wasn't always simple. To get away from something as easy as going to get ice cream with the family could turn into an unplanned get-together of fans and meet large groups of young fan-sold people swarmed Dan everywhere he went. He loved his friends, but he told them in private that being pulled and pushed by strangers wasn't his best thing. His only goal was to see his children, to have a typical childhood, but was getting harder to find. If you want to know how Dan is acting, read on. The bug bit so hard that we have to back up a little while before all the cowboy boots and helmets Dan was really going for a life is very different now because of Dolphia's by. The end of his 3rd year of Dan in college, loved being on stage. He changed his major to speech, and through putting himself in plays, he joined the theatre group Mask and Slippers and played parts in shows like Fumed Oak by Noel Coward, where he played a very funny role, a horrible husband standing next to Dolly Ash. Let's just say they didn't not really need to go too far to play fights between couples on stage, but behind the places where they fell in love. Dan graduated from Hardin Simmons in 1950, college in Abilene, Texas, with a level of speech. Now this is where most guys would want to make money, right? Especially when you have a chance at Major League Football, but not Dan. Nope. He turned down the gridiron but agreed to. He showed early on stage that he wasn't motivated by money or fame, was drawn to do what made his heart beat, race. After high school, he and his friend Dennis Reed took a chance and headed east, joining the summer stock theatre circuit. They kicked things off at the Brattle Hall Theatre in Boston, and Dan even snagged a role in a Broadway production of King Lear. Just as things were heating up, another unexpected plot twist hit Uncle Sam called in 1950. Dan was drafted into the US Army, putting his acting dreams on hold. He spent 4 tough months stationed at Camp Polk in Louisiana. But even in uniform, he couldn't stay away from the stage. He jumped into an Army production of Macbeth, balancing rehearsals with military drills. But the fun didn't last long. After training, Dan was shipped to Japan, then straight into the freezing trenches of the Korean War. And this wasn't just some brief stint. On Christmas Eve 1951, Dan and his squad were trapped by enemy soldiers on Hill 255 for a brutal 10 hours. He faced bitter cold gunfire and exhaustion. But somehow Dan made it through. His service earned him multiple medals, including the Purple Heart, and on September 23, 1952, after 2 grueling years, he was honorably discharged. 2 days later, Dan wasn't wasting any time. He married Dolphia Parker, in a simple noon ceremony in Carlsbad, New Mexico. No, Hollywood lights, just love. And a small town preacher named Reverend J. Dando, starting their life together. Dan and Direface, the same problem. Most young couples do. Money Dan went to Sul Ross State University and finished a master's degree in theatre arts while working as a teacher to keep food on the table first. He taught English and play at a high school in Sonora, Texas, then went to Carlsbad, New Mexico, where he taught 6th grade. Nothing fancy, just hard work, chalk dust, and stacks of papers to grade. But deep down, Dan knew something was still pulling at him. By in the middle of the 1950s with 4 kids and bills, adding up, Dan saw that teaching just wasn't enough to back up the family. What did he do? He rolled Thedis and did it again this time. Westerns were very popular on TV, and Dan's big frame and friendly face made him a ideal fit. He started getting parts in shows like Gunsmoke and The Rifleman Will Travel with a Gun and Maverick small parts at first, but they picked that up again spark inside him. In 1958, Dan scored his first big break on Cimarron City, though the show had promise, but it was cancelled after only 1 season. At first, it hurt, thought it was the best thing in the end that might have happened. Not having to work freed up Dan just in time to see director David Doctor, who was job openings for a brand new Western called Bonanza. And the rest, you probably already know. I know, but trust me. There's more to it than that. Bonanza didn't go off all at once. Though the first season was rough, and no one expected a lot, but all of a sudden, thanks to pay attention to family values, morals, and yes, Dan's sweet performance as host the show went through the roof. Families across America watched it every day, but Dan wasn't. He was the only actor in the group pulse of it. Even though Bonanza huge success, Dan stayed humble. They even did movie parts on the side, going to see Frank Sinatra and Come Blow Your Horn and Put the Lady in Cement. But he should never let fame get to him. He often looked like he didn't understand all the after saying that he didn't pay attention again, figure out why people grabbed him, public as if they knew him personally. He liked making things more than the chaos at home, held things together as best he could, spent time with his children, helping them learn and having fun with them and making them see that Dad was more than a TV cowboy. He loved both of them the most. Dirk and David, his kids, saw the show. Biz bug, but they weren't trying to get famous. In the end, either Dirk became David was a great actor himself, but went behind the scenes of making movies and even won an Emmy for donking only in America. Now here's the part. Dirk isn't something you hear very often. After many years, how much he loved her was acting came from just tagging with his dad to the set. The only real way to spend time with him in those busy years, I watched Dan pose with your co-stars and laugh, and make code work like magic. These times stuck with Dirk. That's how he was sure he wanted to do what his father did. Not only on screen, but also in Dan was more than just a great dad, though. To his own children, let's be clear. The kind of guy everyone on set thought lucky to work with cast crew background. Added items didn't matter because he had this rare skill for making people feel at ease. Mitch Vogel, who played Jaime Hunter Cartwright. In the later years of Bonanza said that Dan was the nicest person ever. Kind of guy you'd want to drink beer with. He was friendly and calm after a long day. Friendly. And trust me, that wasn't. This has always been the case in Hollywood, so when Dan died, it wasn't just down for his family. It shook the entire Bonanza production. We need Topors here. Back in 1972, TV shows just didn't know what to do when a lead actor passed away, unexpectedly. It wasn't like today where you'd see characters written off or honoured in special episodes. For Bonanza, Dan's death was more than a tragedy. It was an unprecedented challenge. How do you continue without the very soul of the show? But before we get there, you should know. Dan had actually made a big move shortly before his passing in 1971. Frustrated and heartbroken by the Vietnam War, he relocated his family to Switzerland. He wanted a quieter, more peaceful life away from the political tension back home. But despite the distance, Dan wasn't ready to walk away from Bonanza. He kept flying back and forth to Los Angeles to film balancing family life in Europe with his Hollywood promises. Then came the spring of 1972. Dan wasn't feeling right. Weak, tired, off balance. He went to the hospital where doctors found he needed gallbladder surgery. A pretty common procedure even back then. Over 1 million gallbladder removals or cholecystectomies were already being performed annually in the US. Dan seemed to take it in stride. He underwent the surgery. Everything looked fine at first. He was recovering, even smiling about finally being free from the gallstones that had been bothering him. But then everything changed while Dan was getting better. Got an arterial embolism all of a sudden, his lungs, which could have killed him. And just like that, he was gone. No notice, no second chances like that on May 13th, 1972. Dan Blocker died. He was 43 years old. The cast, the crew, his family, everyone was blindsided. His funeral was private, just as Dan would have wanted. He was laid to rest in Woodman Cemetery in his hometown of Dalb, Texas, buried beside his parents and sister. His closest friend from the show, Lauren Green, who played Ben Cartwright, was crushed. In fact, Lauren told his wife simply, "That's it, it's finished." And honestly, he wasn't wrong. Without Hos, Bonanza would never be the same. But they gave it one more try. The producers felt they owed it to the fans and the cast to finish what they started. They moved forward with a final season, but they couldn't ignore the elephant in the room. Dan's character Hos was gone, and I didn't brush it, like most shows did back then. They did something brave by letting the grief show. They didn't say how Who's died, but they made sure no one else saw him, was felt in every episode. Michael Landon, who played Little Joe, wrote the first 2 parts of the season called with Dan in mind always. After the tragedy, Landon rewrote the entire thing, shifting the spotlight to Little Joe. What resulted was one of the most emotional and heartbreaking episodes the series ever produced. Joe falls in love, gets married, looks forward to a child, and then loses everything in one night to a brutal act of violence. Behind those scenes, what you don't see on camera is the real pain. The cast wasn't just acting grief, they were living it. And then there was that unforgettable moment when Ben and Joe visited the grave of Joe's wife and unborn child. Ben quietly says he knows what it feels like to lose a son. He wasn't just talking about the character, he was talking about Hos Helwas, talking about Dan. And if you look closely, you'll notice the actors weren't just performing, they were mourning. Despite their best efforts, the magic was fading, ratings had already been slipping. But after Dan's death, it was like the heart had been ripped out of the show. Bonanza lost its prime. Sunday night slot and got bumped to Tuesdays at 8 p.m, and forcing it to fight with ABC's blockbuster movie of the week. Audiences wandered away. By 1973, the show was officially cancelled after an incredible 14-season run. But Dan's story doesn't end there. His presence could still be felt long after the cameras stopped rolling. In the 1988 TV movie Bonanza, the Next Generation fans finally got closure when it was revealed that Hos Cartwright died a hero drowning while saving someone else's life. It wasn't much, but it seemed right. That's exactly how people thought. Dan would have liked it. Dan had been working on a quiet fortune. By the time he died, his net worth was thought to be about $5 million, a large amount for the early 1970s. He made a smart investment by buying multiple properties, including a sprawling 5,000-square FT mansion in Los Angeles' upscale Hancock Park neighborhood. Years later, the house would famously be owned by rock star and filmmaker Rob Zombie. He also held property in Englewood, further proof that Dan wasn't just good at acting. He knew how to secure his family's future. And speaking of legacy, there's one more piece. You probably don't know about Dan Blocker. Beach Yeppen. Actual beach. In the 1970s, his closest friends, Michael Landon and Lauren Green, bought a stretch of Malibu coastline. They could have turned it into million-dollar homes, but they donated it in Dan's memory. In 1979, It officially became Dan Blocker Beach, and it's still there today. A quiet, windswept length of sand that waves are crashing against. The shore will always be a memorial. To the big guy with the even bigger heart. Even after many years, Dan's kids Dirk said, never forget about him. To have a successful job, most notably as Detective Hitchcock on Brooklyn 999, while David blossomed behind the scenes, Evan winning an Emmy in 1998. They often share stories and photos of their dad telling the world that beyond the cowboy hats, beyond, the famed Dan Blocker was first and foremost a father, a husband, and a man who lived with kindness. And the abandoned house, well, it wasn't abandoned for long. That Hancock Park house may have changed hands, but for the people who knew Dan, the real home was never the bricks and wood. It was the love he brought into every room, where he laughed with his kids, and how he made sure everyone, from friends to family, important.